Stephanie, do you want me just to run in through the housekeeping really quick while people are still kind of logging in?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. We still have a little bit more time before we'll get started. People are still slowly trickling into the room. So this is the Weed Management Workshop. My name is Mel Graham and I'm with the County of Santa Barbara, and I am going to be your kind of co-pilot today, and I'm going to help out with any of the continuing education that you may need. So just a couple things as far as housekeeping today is, in order to receive the DPR continuing education credits, you need to be the registrant. That way we keep track of who's attending and that sort of thing. If you do get kicked off, go ahead and hop back on. We want to make sure that you're here for the entire training. At the end of the training, you're going to receive a link to the exam. The exam is something that's required by DPR for all online trainings. We just kind of have it a little separately through a website. You'll click on the link. I will also email it to everybody, and it'll be in the chat before we end our presentation today. With that, just kind of going into webinars, everybody that's attending right now is muted. I hopefully have moved most all of our presenters over into the panelist portion, and they are co-hosts and will be able to present their screens. If you as an attendee need technical assistance, please use the chat window. And if you don't see the chats or the kind of windows at the bottom or the top of your screen, just kind of hover your mouse over there and it should pop up. If you have questions for the presenters, please use a Q&A window. So technical assistance, use the chat. Questions for the presenters, use the Q&A window, please. And the window and links may appear either at the top of your screen or more traditionally at the bottom of your screen. Again, for continuing education, after the course is complete, you're going to be emailed a link, and it'll also be in the chat during the webinar. You'll go ahead and take the exam, fill out your information, including your DPR license number. You can take the exam as many times as you need to pass with 70%. And you will receive a certificate of completion to download immediately once you've passed the exam. So again, make sure that you download that certificate for your records. Okay, that's all I have.
Do we want to go ahead and get going, or do you think we'll have some more people?
We have about 35 people right now, and they should kind of be trickling in, but it's up to you.
I think go ahead and let's get started.
All right. Great. Mel, I don't know, do you want to put up the agenda while I do the welcome?
Sure.
Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. I am Anna Olson. I'm the Executive Director of the Cachuma Resource Conservation District and the co-chair of our Santa Barbara County Weed Management Area. We have a great selection and panel of speakers today presenting on various methods of weed control and integrated pest management. And we are excited to be able to have them share their information with you this morning. As Mel said, please make sure to use the chat and Q&A feature if you've got any questions for any of us. And just also reiterating that the CEU credits will be made, the link will be made available, of course, after the workshop. I don't know if Mel said, but this is going to be recorded, so it will be available for you to go back if you need or would like to review any of the information gone over today. But I know that you must be attending this webinar live in order to be able to get those CEU credits. So just saying that, and then we will hope to have all of the presentations slides available after the fact as well. And then I'm going to also put in a plug for tomorrow. We do have a WMA meeting in person at 9 a.m. And we will be having a site visit at Elwood Mesa Monarch Grove after. So if anybody is interested in participating in that, you can email me and I can send you the agenda and any additional information. Additionally, you can also, if you're unable to attend the meeting in person and just want to join us for the site visit, you're more than welcome to do that. And I can send you the location information. I will put my email address in the chat box here as we get moving on, but just a little bit of info on our site visit. As I said, it will be at the Elwood Mesa Monarch Butterfly Grove, and then we will be meeting with George Thompson, and he will be going over the project that they have going on right now to enhance habitat for the migratory monarch butterflies and restore a portion of Devereaux Creek. And so we will also be going over the enhancement plan and discuss the specific invasive species and their control plans that they have in place or that they're implementing there in that area. And so if you have any questions for me about that, again, I'll put my email address in the chat, and so you can just go ahead and email me if you would like to join or would like to find out more information about our WMA meeting tomorrow. And let's see. And so as you can see here with our agenda, we will be having Royce Larson from UC Cooperative Extension kicking us off this morning, going over some rangeland weeds. Then we will be having Jack Thrift Anderson from Quiana Lamb discussing prescribed herbivory, especially as a tool for both fire management and weed abatement. And then we'll be getting a Calipsi update from Doug Johnson. After that, we'll have a 10-minute break and we'll get into application of steam for weed management, which I'm very excited to hear about. And then following that, some pesticide safety and vertebrate pest control discussion. And then we'll do a wrap up. And so Stephanie, I don't know if you have anything else that you would like to add before we get started.
No, I don't, but thanks everybody for joining us, and click we're ready to go. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mel.
Great. So with that, we'll go ahead and hand it off to Royce.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Glad I was invited to give this little talk about weeds on rangelands, and my focus will be on whether these weeds are any value in terms of what they are to livestock, or are they just a nuisance and they're toxic and cause all kinds of problems. So with that, the next slide. So rangelands, and I think everybody probably understands it, they're the areas that are not farmed, they're not urban. Most of our forest land in the Central Coast is also considered rangeland. So it could have oak trees and savannas on it, but it's to make it important to understand it's not just cattle. There's a lot of wildlife out there, a lot of plants out there, and the involvement of all those things, or the management of all those, is important. Next slide. Wanted to just say it very quickly. It's always fun when you're out on rangelands to see the state grass, the purple needle grass, and also the state flower, the California poppy. And we run into those quite often out on rangelands. Next slide. So what we see a lot of on the Central Coast, common grasses that are found: soft chest brome, annual fescues, wild oak, ryegrass, false brome, red brome, foxtail, ripgut, and then of course purple needle grass, and occasionally some other perennials. Common forbs, the broadleafed plants. The fillery is the most common, and then burr clover, We have quite a few of these other small trifolium clovers and deer vetch, purple vetch in some places, and of course the California poppy. This particular slide shows a mixture of annual fescue and bur clover. Okay, next slide. How much grows out there on our rangeland is, it depends. It depends on the year and the amount of rainfall, the timing of the rainfall, as well as the temperatures. So, and here's some slides, 2 sites I've been monitoring for a long time. On the left, it's a coastal site. In 2006, there was about 10,000 pounds per acre production. There was 28 inches of rain that year. 2014, our huge drought, that was down to 3,100 pounds per acre, but we had about 7 inches of rain, so a lot less rain. But out east, where it's much drier and hotter, out by the Carrizo Plains, that 2006 year, we had 4,000 pounds per acre production, but in 2014, 31 pounds per acre and under 2 inches of rainfall. It was hard to actually sample the production. It was a tiny little leaf kind of here and there, and you had to be very careful to pick it up. So certainly nothing there for wildlife. There's no wildflowers, etc. It was a hard year. Next slide. Some potential threats on rangelands, and I just real briefly go over these. Some of the invasive weeds that we worry about, the artichoke thistle, and there's other thistles. And of course, down in our waterways, the arundo, barbed goat grass, caped ivy, French broom, hoary cress, jabata grass. Medusa head is one that's becoming a bigger concern. The spurges, the pampas grass, the pepper weeds, purple purple star thistle, and Spanish broom, the tree of heaven, velt grass is a concern in some areas. The distaff thistle, yellow star thistle can be a huge problem. And then salt cedar and tamarisk. These are ones that are potentially invasive and need to be monitored and worried about. But I'm going to talk about a couple of them, but more about some other weeds that are more common. And the next slide. One of the things that I have noticed as I've been monitoring for over 20 years now on the Central Coast is how much of a driver the weather is. And you can call the weather what you want. You can call it global warming, you can call it climate change, you can call it whatever. That this talk isn't for that purpose. The purpose is, what is the weather doing? And Phyllis Diller had a comment one time in one of her shows quite a while ago where she says that we Californians are constantly accused of not having seasons. And she said, but we do. Next slide. We have fire, flood, mud, and drought. And we see that over and over, and it's getting worse and worse as the climate is changing and we're moving into the future more. The droughts are getting more severe and worse. When we do have a wet year, it's getting more severe, and flooding, and the fires are coming. And then if you get a big rain on a fire, like down there on the Santa Barbara on the 101, you know, the mud, the conditions are getting worse. Next slide. In addition to rainfall and whatnot, the temperature is changing. We're getting warmer. Rainfall is decreasing overall, even though we have the wet years, but temperature is getting warmer. This is a a graph out of a publication from Bill TG that they put together. And there's a pretty good increase in temperature going on that is a big concern. Next slide. But I'm going to mostly talk, remember the temperature in the background, but I'm going to talk more about rainfall as being a driver of what's happening. And as we look at, this is a graph of Paso Robles rainfall from 1887 until now. And we look at that, that's up and down each year. The average is about 15 inches. If you can see the smaller red line, that's a trend. It is a downward trend, although it's not a huge downward trend, but it is there. Probably the bigger factor though, or one of the bigger factors, is the graph below that, where the blue is the average over that since 1888 period of time on a monthly basis. And we normally get a germinating rain by November. December, January, February, March are fairly wet months, and then it starts to dry out. The red bar was 2021-22 season, the water year from July through June. As you can see, we had a tremendously wet December, nothing in January and February, not very much in March, and very little in April. That shows that each year is different, and we can't depend on that nice bell curve of getting that average every year. Next slide. This is breaking that graph up from 1888 to 1955, the top graph. And I just picked a couple of values where the average was 15. I chose 10 as a significant number. That anything below that, we're really struggling in terms of growing our forage, growing rangeland plants, growing crops. And the darker purple in that graph shows all the years that are below 10 inches. In this case, there were 7 of them. Going up to extreme events, and I chose 25 inches, where we start getting flooding and concerns of too much water. And during that period of time, there were 4 years. But if you look at the lower graph, that's from 1956 until 2022. The number of years below that 10 inches went from 7 to 21. And the number of extreme events went from 4 to 8. And all I'm saying with this is things are changing. We're getting these more extreme dry periods and more extreme wet periods. Next. With that, with the climate the way it's been going and the changes that have been making, so are the production out on rangelands, and so is the weeds that are there. This is just an example of, it's actually here by the Templeton office, and that cheeseweed or malva, 2010, it was as tall as a person. 2016, it was only about thigh high. So it is different every year. And that's the point, is not only what grows, but how much grows changes every year. And I believe strongly that it is rainfall and temperature that is the driver that causes that. Next slide. So these, and it's a little hard to follow these graphs. I hope I don't lose you. The upper graph, the green are the grasses. The brown are the forbs. And of course, the blue is the rainfall. And you can see, and this is over on a coastal area. So, you know, greater than 18 inches of rainfall, cooler, etc. The grasses are dominant. the grasses certainly fluctuate from year to year, but not that much of fluctuation. During the very severe drought of 2012 through 2015, the grasses dropped and the forbs came up quite a bit there. But if you look at the bottom graph, that's the 12 to 20 inch rainfall zone. So off of the coastal ways and going inland, you see the changes in the grass forb component changing quite a bit each year. And the grasses in general, they have a decline going on. If you look at the trend, the solid green bar, and the solid brown bar has an increase going on from 2001 until now. Next slide. This went one too far. So that pattern is really severe when we get out in our much drier areas like Clayama and Carrizo Plains and those sites where we have less than 12 inches of rainfall on average each year. That fluctuation and the change between the grasses and the forbs happens regularly. There's a big decrease in grasses going on over the 20-year period out there with an increase in forbs. Some of those increases, certainly fillery and burr clover and some other clovers, but we're seeing a lot more mustard, cheeseweed, morning glory, tocolote, yellow star thistle, Russian thistle, and spikeweed, and lupins and fiddlenecks, and Jimson weed, and blue curls, and turkey mullein, and etc. They're all increasing over these years. Next slide. I want to just talk briefly about the grasses, and this is probably myself, but one of the big things I've seen happen out there in these drier areas is a big change of dominance from soft chest to red brome. In terms of livestock, that's a concern. Soft chest is a much better forage, and it's actually hard to get livestock to eat the red brome once it begins to dry down. Next slide. This shows, this is in the less than 12 inch rainfall zone on the top. That red line is the red brome, and the trend is it is shooting sky high out there. Whereas the soft chest that was there has gone down. It's hard to find it anymore. And again, these are the sites that I monitor. So in other places, there could be some. When we come into the 12 to 20 inch rainfall zone, we see the same pattern, quite as severe, but the pattern is there. It's those warmer, drier summers that are driving that red brome, which is more adapted to a hotter, drier climate than the soft chest is. Next slide, please. So looking at crude protein and fiber in some of these plants. First, looking at the top slide, the green feed, that's early in the year, February, you move into April when it matures, May when it finally dries out, October after it's sat all summer and weathered. And the graph on the left shows the relative value of the crude protein and the fiber. By April and May, the protein in the grasses are below what an animal needs in their diet. The fiber increases also, the green dotted line in grasses rapidly. Forbs also decrease in their protein, but they have a much higher protein content than the grasses do. So they can play a very important role out on rangelands. Same with the fiber. The fiber is lower than the grasses. Next slide, please. That is important in that, you know, what will an animal eat? And I'm not going to go into the prescribe grazing and stuff to help control weeds, but rather to point out that some weeds have value for that. And it may not be the entire plant or the whole plant. This is an example of the summer mustard. And I've seen this a lot where you go out after grazing and the leaves are gone and the stems are still there. Well, the leaves have very high protein, are very low in fiber. The stems, on the other hand, are just opposite. They're very low in the protein and very high in fiber. Makes sense that the animals would eat the leaves and leave the rest. The next slide, please. The other thing that's out there then, we have this dry vegetation through the summer, and there's many of these weeds that grow through this time, through this period. Some of those are non-toxic. The summer mustard, the cheeseweed, the spikeweed, the morning glory. Some of them, they might have some toxins in them, but normally if there's a lot of other feed, any of these won't hurt the animals. But this, on the other side, the gypsum weed in particular is very high in toxins. The local weeds, if they eat too much of that, or the lupins or the fiddleneck or the blue curls or the turkey mullein, they're all have toxin levels in them that can be harmful and even in some cases fatal. Part of the problem is, next slide, please. Part of the problem is what's out there available to them when all of the grasses are dried up and the forage quality is very low. And if they're not getting supplements, it's going to kind of force them to go to these weeds. And this particular suite of weeds, the summer mustard, the cheeseweed, and I put owl's clover in this. There's a licorice plant, morning glory, tocolote, yellow star thistle, Russian thistle, and spikeweed were all very high in crude protein. Later in the year, the yellow star thistle, especially, maybe the tocolote, can prevent grazing by mechanical means because of the spines. But prior to that, they actually can be a good feed for animals. The next slide. But that other group, the toxic plants, they also have high crude protein. But again, they have toxins in them. If the animals do eat those, like I said, they can cause severe health issues and or fatalities. It's almost easy though to understand why, if all the grass around you has 3% crude protein and you come in and you find, the local weeds and the blue curls and the curly docks and the gypsum weed and all those with really high crude protein. And if that cow needs it, or sheep, they will go after it. And I've had ranchers report fatalities from cattle eating some of these weeds. Next slide, please. Oops. There we go. Closing one there. One more. Okay, good. So just in closing, the first point, weather plays a very big role in what grows and how much grows. Some years I'll see a huge stand of yellow star thistle. Other years it'll hardly be there. Same with the mustards, same with the spikeweeds. And also with some of the toxic plants, the local weeds and the lupins. Some years they're much more than others, and I believe rainfall and temperature are the drivers of those. Some of the weeds, which maybe we think of as a nuisance, may actually provide nutritional value to livestock. And that to me ought to be explored more and looked at. The other thing is learn which ones are toxic and those are ones we really need to look at in terms of rangelands on how to control them. There's a lot more information available about the nutrient and toxin levels of many of these that I talked about. And I've got the references there below. In the Grasslands Journal, we have a paper out that shows these values of crude protein and the toxin levels in many of those plants. There's others at UCANR that talk about plants that are toxic to livestock, and others that would show, how to use livestock to control some of these weeds. So with that, I will end unless there are questions.
Not seeing any in the chat or the Q&A, but we will have time later on as well. But if anybody has any questions, please submit them to the chat right now. And if I don't see any, then we will move on. Not seeing any. If you do think of any afterwards, please, you can email. Oh, wait, hold on. I do have one question. Have you noticed any trends of broadleaf versus grasses and the timing of the rains?
That is a really good question, and the answer is yes. I just don't have data summarized to show that. And it may, as we get the earlier rains, it tends to favor the broadleaves more from what I've seen. But it's real complicated because there's a big factor of how much old thatch or RDM that we refer to it as is there on the ground. Lower RDM, or in other words, more bare ground, really favors the broadleaves over the grasses. And so there's a good question, but it's a complicated to get to the answer to that.
Thank you. Not seeing any other questions. If you do think of any after the fact, you can email me. Again, my email is in the chat, and I can get those sent over to Royce for you to hopefully get answered. So moving on, we are happy to have Kuyama Lamb joining us to go over prescribed herbivory, as I said, for weed management, as well as for fuel load control. So we have Jack joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you, Jack, and we look forward to hearing what you have to present to us.
Hey, thank you so much. Glad to be here, y'all. And yeah, Royce, appreciate your share there. Definitely, rangeland health is a big motivator for ours, and we followed some of the stuff you're doing. So thanks for that. Let me share a screen here. Does that look like a slideshow, everyone? Okay, my name is Jack Anderson. I'm just talking here about weed mitigation with prescribed herbivory. Our operation is Kuyama Lamb. We use primarily sheep, but also goats occasionally to manage and mitigate weeds and fire fuels throughout the county. We started in Kuyama, focused around doing native grassland restoration, trying to bring back a lot of the native populations or increase the health of those populations within this big basin sage community. Now we range all over Santa Barbara County and work in many different vegetation types. So prescribed herbivory, the difference between prescribed herbivory and sort of traditional grazing, I think simply has to do with setting goals for the impact of that grazing. So a prescription is going to meet a specific need or goal. And so I think it's always important to look when we're talking about weeds and weed management. What we also want to be thinking about is, what do we want to see? We want to see usually a diversity of plants. We want to see higher quantities of natives, or we might want to see fire-safe environments, or we might just want to see the eradication of a particular type of weed. But I think it's always important to set those positive goals as well, because often if you focus on eradication, then something else is just going to come up. In thinking about that plant diversity, there's going to be a few different things that could potentially cause plant diversity. And this slide is sort of just an example of some of the goals you could set. There are going to be, there's several causes for that weed invasion or a lack of plant diversity. There's the removal of native vegetation, which happens in the context of fires and development, and it happens in the context of overgrazing. But also it happens in the context of thatching, like the invasive weeds developing thick impenetrable barriers and our native vegetation not being able to take root and grow up in that. It's particularly a problem for things like Stipropulchra, our native grasses, and our native wildflowers and forbs. But also those things can end up crowding out native chaparral plants as well, or making it too difficult for those things to develop. So there are several ways that we can use grazing to impact these different structures. Here's an example of a fence line where we've come in with some mustard that was flowering, and we've completely removed the flower and trampled all the stalks. Occasionally you'll have some recovery after this, but this is a pretty efficient removal of the seed stock of these plants. They can also come in after the mustard has dried off and completely open those soils back up to provide opportunities for things that are underneath to come through. And also ruminants, particularly sheep and goats, will digest weed seeds up to 70–80% efficiency. So they'll actually go into these mustard stands like this, and they'll suck down those seeds, chew them up, and swallow them, and digest the majority of them. There's a wide variety, so it really depends on the type of seed, how efficiently they're going to be grazed. But mustard seed, they do really particularly well. This is another example of how we're removing thatch of those annual weedy brome grasses that Royce was speaking about, to try to create a benefit for the native perennial grasses here. So this is San Marcos Foothills, where we work with Channel Island Restoration to do weed management and bird habitat enhancement. And mostly we're doing that by encouraging and helping maintain the native grasslands. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a lot of thatched material over and in between the different grasses from annuals that are sort of starting to crowd out some of those bunch grasses. And then you can see on the left where we have grazed it off, there the bunch grasses have recovered really well. They are flowering for a second time this season, actually, and they have a lot of space in between them for new plants to recruit. This is also, you know, the level of recovery and how quickly and how efficiently these plants are going to recover is also highly rainfall dependent. So that's an important consideration. Also, timing is really important. Like, here is a situation, and depending on your different goals, here's a situation at Arroyo Hondo, the preserve on the coast owned by the Santa Barbara Land Trust, in which we went in during a flowering period, and a lot of the annual and invasive grasses and weeds were much more palatable than this native Stipropolcra that was here in the pasture. And so by not hitting things really hard, we can have the sheep actually select away from some natives like this. And these are now recovering really nicely with plenty of room. We can also work in really extreme environments. This is up in the tea gardens, which you all might be familiar with. This is after the tea fire, I believe it's like 10-year regrowth. There's starting to be some weed invasion here into the chaparral. And you might be able to see that there's some sheep buried down in that real tall chaparral there. And so we came in, and not only are we, so this is a context in which we're doing fire fuel mitigation. And so a lot of times in these thick chaparral settings, you'll have dense annual vegetation in between these shrubs, which ends up carrying the fire. Often healthy stands of chaparral that have some space between them, that have some diversity in them, are going to be actually quite resistant to burning, particularly if the moisture in the vegetation is at a higher level. So in this context, we are just clearing spaces between those shrubs to create a situation that looks more like this. And that can effectively stop fire or can reduce the behavior enough that it can be put out. So fire fuel mitigation or weed control for the purpose of controlling fire can look a lot of different ways. This is like in an annual grassland environment, we can take things or prescribed grazers can take things down really hard and create sort of a situation that fire is really not going to have anything to burn at all, like this. I mean, sheep are and animals are amazing in the way that they digest that material rather than just drop it on the ground. And so you can see that not only has it been integrated back into the soil in the context of manure, but now it is inflammable. Or you can graze things much softer, like in this context, where we trampled a lot of stems, left a lot of things on the ground, left a lot of vegetation there, but have significantly changed the way that fire is going to behave when it reaches this landscape. So this is a lot of annual grasses. There's some Russian thistle in there. There's a lot of different thistles. And that is going to be, that's going to significantly change the environment. And it's also going to, again, that trampled grass is going to decompose as soon as moisture is coming towards it, and is going to provide more opportunities for natives to come up in that landscape. Here is some fire fuel control in some coastal chaparral with coyote bush here, and there's some coastal sagebrush in there. Those shrubs do tend to recover within a few months to a year of being heavily grazed like this. So we can create those spaces of the in between those shrubs. Here's an example of some toyon that's been taken up and the weeds around it being removed. So in this context, you could lift up some of your desirable natives and create more of a canopy and be removing those ladder fuels and those carrier fuels underneath them. And during the Alisol fire, it came right through a ranch that we work on. And so we got to see our work in action in a way that's really amazing. This is an example of where a fire just followed exactly along our fence line and simply stopped burning. We had put our fence on the far side of this road there. On the left side, we had grazed with sheep. There were, clearly there was still some vegetation there, but it simply didn't burn on that side. Here is an example of a lightly grazed zone, a zone that we didn't take all the way down. In the background there, you can see that there's kind of spots of fire that went through it, but it sort of went out. You can see in the foreground, that is an area that we didn't graze, and it's completely charred. Here is a video of some of that annual vegetation. It's mustard stalks and thistle stalks that are tall, and it's burning. Those are about 20-foot flames. You can see I'm pretty far away because it's making me pretty nervous over there. These are relatively calm wind conditions, and so I think it's important to measure in those. Most of the time in heavy, high wind conditions, there isn't much that anyone can do to combat fire, and so it's when there are those wind opportunities, when the wind is calm enough, the weather is calm enough to intervene, that it's important to see how these things operate. Here is an example of fire behavior in a lightly grazed zone. You can see the fire is much smaller, I'd say about a foot tall, as opposed to, I think, 20 feet tall, the last flames there, and it's moving slowly. I'm actually at the top of this hill and watching it come up towards me, and it's moving so slowly that I'm really not that concerned about it. And this is that hillside right here. It was coming up sort of all along that left-hand side, and I was standing on this road here watching it. Interestingly, this on the right-hand side of that road is an area that we did not graze. You can see that it's still thick with thatched vegetation. And because of the fire conditions, because of the weather conditions, because the fire was moving more slowly and less intensely, it simply stopped at that road, even though there was plenty of fuel on the other side. And one of the wonderful things about using prescribed grazing is that you take all of those weeds and nasty things that we're trying to get rid of, and you turn them into wonderful products that can be used in our communities. This is some of our fine merino wool that we've started to produce last year and distribute in the community, and also are working with a local fiber artist. And this is some of our delicious lamb meat that we distribute also locally. We're now using a local butcher and do local lamb shares. So that's a pretty amazing alchemy to go from nasty weed, nasty mustard seeds, and all that crazy vegetation to beautiful meat products. And yeah, that's sort of what I have to share there. You're welcome to check us out on kuyamalam.com. You can send us a message there, or Instagram. You can look at @kuyamalam. And I'm happy to answer some questions. Stick around a little bit if folks have any.
Thanks, Jack. Any questions? Not seeing
Maybe
one thing
anything
that I-
currently in the chat. Okay.
Yeah,
Hi,
go ahead.
Jack. Yeah, hi, it's Stephanie with Santa Barbara County Ag Department. I was just wondering if there's been any research or if you have any thoughts on the use of prescribed herbivory around really steep areas where erosion might be a problem, or how the impacts of sheep might be on just on land in general for erosion and things like that. Or bringing in weed seeds in general on their hoofs. I was wondering if you had anything to add to that, thoughts on that.
Yeah, that was one thing that I was just gonna add as some of the concerns of prescribed herbivory as you're making a management decision. And one of them is definitely seed spread. And so often, for us, often when we're looking at different types of plant communities, we're seeing, okay, are these animals moving from a disturbed environment into a native environment? Or is there a weed presence here that is not present in this new site that we're going to? That's sort of the first level of defense. But the second and the most the most effective way to deal with that issue is to do what we call purging. And so we often will buy certified weed-free hay and feed it to the animals for 5 days or so, which is about the length it takes for contents to move from the rumen all the way through the digestive system and out. And so we can feed alfalfa for that period of time while they're contained in a corral and remove any seed that might be transported through their feces. There is the possibility of weed transfer through wool as well, which is why we shear the sheep before seed drop, and then they don't pick that up, and they kind of go through that intense season without those wool coats. As far as soil erosion, definitely there are some more sensitive soils than others, soils that move around more. We've had, we've definitely put sheep in places where the soil moved significantly. But for the most part, it's a much more gentle impact than, for instance, using a masticator, or sometimes even having people working in an environment. So I would say definitely use discernment when thinking about having potentially hundreds of animals moving on a slope. But they are really effective at steep slope work, and we've even put them on extreme slopes, and they have no problem with that.
Thank you. I am not seeing any other questions in the Q&A or the chat. If anybody has any, go ahead and submit them now. Otherwise, as I previously said, you can email me and I can get those over to Jack to get answered for you if you think of them after the fact.
Maybe one other thing that I'll just offer to consider is that disturbance always causes opportunities for more invasion. So whenever you're creating fresh disturbance or opening space up in an area, again, going back to those goals of knowing what you want to have as opposed to what you're trying to get rid of is going to help you make decisions that are not going to degrade or create opportunities for new invasions of weeds.
Thank you for that. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to move on to our next presenter, and that is Doug Johnson. He is the Executive Director for the California Invasive Plant Council. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. And that was really interesting to hear from Royce and Jack on some on the ground work for weed control. I'm going to step up to a kind of 20,000 foot view here. I am, yes, Doug Johnson, Executive Director of the California Invasive Plant Council. Calipsi, if you are not aware of it, is a nonprofit organization. We've been around about 30 years in California, and we formed to make sure that land managers can share their information with each other and with researchers so that the work can get done as well as possible. So there are kind of a variety of settings shown here through some photos of the kind of folks we work with, from invasive Spartina in San Francisco Bay in the top left to Arundo below that. I think those are CAL FIRE crews in the other SB county, San Benito. Top in the middle is some water hyacinth in the Delta, some UC Davis and USDA researchers measuring that. Below that in the middle is rancher spraying yellow star thistle on his land in Yolo County. And then on the right is state parks working on broom, and that could be anywhere from the coast up to the mountains. So some of the kinds of folks that are involved in Calipsi and use our resources. And so this is a quick list of some of the resources on our website before I talk about two particular projects that we've been involved in recently that I think will be of interest. So on our website is the Calipsi Inventory, which is basically the list of weeds that we maintain that has historically rated invasive plants in California based on their environmental impact. More recently, we have also added watch species, which have been evaluated with the pre-tool developed by UC Davis that screens plants for their future potential to become invasive in California. So we've run plants that are currently escaped and growing in wildlands, but don't seem to be spreading. We've run a couple hundred of those through the pre-tool, and the ones that came out as a high risk of becoming invasive in the future are now included in the inventory as watch species. There's a library of best management practices and a variety of reports and videos, et cetera. There are web pages for each of the weed management areas across the state, excuse me, and those can now be maintained by the WMAs themselves, which is good. There are 30 years worth of symposium presentations, that's our annual conference, and newsletter articles from our Calipsi newsletter. And then the Cal Weed Mapper tool, which we'll look at in a minute, which has been developed for regional planning. So those are some of the things that are available on the website. There also are some resources having to do with landscaping, which plant species are in the trade that ideally won't be used, and some of the landscaping alternatives that can be used safely, some things like that. Quick mention of this year's symposium. Like the last 2 years, it will be online November 1st through 3rd. However, we are having two in-person events, one in Southern California and one in Northern California this summer. So June 13th at Cal Poly Pomona and July 18th up here in the East Bay at CSU East Bay in Concord. And so that's 3 days worth of sessions and posters and discussion groups. There's a statewide WMA meeting. A number of things happen. Last year we had over 700 people register, which was great. I think being online has its disadvantages, but it does lower the bar for participation. Don't have to travel, et cetera. So one of the main things Calipsi does is provide decision support tools, and there are a number of those, and they fill different needs. So one thing is knowing which plants are important to know about, and that's, I mentioned the inventory, our list. I also mentioned the pre-tool, which helps to screen plants that could be a problem in the future. Where are plants a problem, or given where you are, which plants are a problem? That's what Cal Weed Mapper is for. And to support strategies of early detection, rapid response in particular. And then what control strategies are most useful. And that's where the best management practices that we've put together come in handy, both for prevention and for control techniques. And this new tool called Weed Cut, which I'll discuss more. So let's start with the topic of regional prioritization. So I mentioned Cal Weed Mapper. This is a screenshot of it on the right, and it can do two things. You can select a plant and/or you can select a region. And so you can look at one plant at a time. So right now it's looking at barb goatgrass, and it's looking at a region. So we have different kinds of regions. We have state park sectors, we have national forests, we have WMAs, and then we have our planning regions in there. So the South Central Coast Planning Region comprises Santa Barbara County and San Luis Obispo County. And so that's what you're seeing on the right, and it's showing USGS quads where barb goatgrass is known to be present. But if you look down here under South Central Coast, you can see that it's listing, it says there are 18 species that are considered surveillance management opportunities, 29 that are eradication opportunities, 159 that are containment, and of those 63 are managed. So there's a lot of information here that can be output for a given region, and I'll explain how that can be used in a moment. So we have had a project the last couple of years working with the California Department of Food and Agriculture to help set regional priority species. And this is a living list. This is a first cut, but CDFA is interested in having a set of species for each region that are kind of agreed upon as consensus targets for relatively early detection and rapid response. Like, let's go after these things before they become more widespread. So just, we've all, understand the concept of getting things early. I just want to remind us that, yellow star thistle wasn't always growing over 14 million acres in California. And it takes a while and then it takes off, right? That's the kind of the common lag phase. And more recently, stinkwort, Tetrachia graveolens. I remember in the Bay Area here, hearing in San Mateo County and Santa Clara County, like, hey, there's this new thing, we should probably get on it. Well, it's too late now. So we're trying to be ready for the next. We know that it's a dynamic environment with more things happening all the time. So here's another more recent one. This is the 5-year change in number of records in Cal Flora for stinknet, a big problem in Southern California. In 2017, there were 26 records in this greater SoCal area. And now 5 years later, there's over 1,000 records. So part of that is people contributing data, but part of it is that stinknet is really spreading. Another weed of concern in Southern California, although most places haven't seen it yet, is Voluteria tubuliflora. There are a couple of points out on the coast, one in Newport Bay, one in Chula Vista, but otherwise, this is it in North America. This huge infestation in Borrego Springs out in eastern San Diego County. And we have started the process of really delimiting where the population ends. It's starting to spread out along this road, the Salton Sea, and trying to gather the funds and the resources to control this each season, that there's actually enough rain that it blooms. But we're trying to keep it from becoming as widespread as something like Sahara mustard, which this volunteer is shown here holding up a Sahara mustard and a desert knapweed plant. So that's the goal, is to catch things early and to not let them get out of control. Here's another Southern California aquatic weed, a seaweed that you may have heard of. Sometime back, I believe it was 2005, if I'm not mistaken, there was a Calerpa Taxifolia, a couple finds in Southern California that were eradicated and kind of held up as a example of how agencies can team together and get on something quickly, which you have to do when something's aquatic because it can spread super quickly. So this is another aquarium trade plant, I believe, and so it's been found in Newport Bay, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is working to contain it and ideally eradicate it. So we undertook this process with CDFA to develop regional priorities throughout the state. And so these are the multi-county, multi-WMA regions that we worked with, somewhat eco-regional, but sticking for the most part with county boundaries, because those jurisdictional boundaries really affect what can be done by, say, the county agricultural commissioner in particular. And so we talked to primarily the agricultural commissioners in each county, but also tried to collect some information from the WMAs in each county on, so we started with a set of species for that region. Actually, let me see if I can. We started with a list of species that are CDFA rated, so they're on the noxious weed list and or have an ABC rating from CDFA, in part because those are the weeds that CDFA can send money to ag commissioners to control at this point, in part based on CEQA coverage. So CDFA rated, and there's almost all of them are on, well, the ones that are CDFA rated are on Calipsi's list. There are some that are on Calipsi's list that aren't on CDFA's lists, but that's fairly minor at this point. So CDFA rated, found in less than 10% of the region. So if you think back to Cal Weed Mapper and those USGS quads, by looking at all the quads in the region and saying, hey, we only want plants that are in fewer than 10% of the quads, that takes the slice of the plants that aren't widespread yet. And then what are the plants that are being worked on throughout that region? So in the South Central Coast region of San Luis Obispo County and Santa Barbara County, that meant that both counties were actively working on and or committed to working on those species. In other regions like the Bay Area, that's 9 counties. So that's a lot of concurrence that needs to be found. So you can see there's, the regions are listed here. They're in varying sizes from a 1 county region in the desert to a 9 county region in the Bay Area. The number of EDRR targets varies widely as well, and not always with the size of the counties or of the regions. It depends in some cases on how active the commissioner's offices are with going after weeds and how big a priority it is. So I think that's part of CDFA's goal too, is to reestablish across the state a baseline of commitment to getting weeds. And so they're not hammering anyone now saying you have to go after this, but just trying to document where things are at now, what people are currently going after, and maintaining that institutional knowledge through staff changes and that kind of thing. So for the South Central Coast, again, this is a living list. This isn't comprehensive to say this is everything that people are working on. As a matter of fact, we had a long list associated with each of the regions of all the things that are being worked on, but not necessarily at the level of containment or control. So the ideal is containment, which means that basically you're working on every population, known population of that plant species in the region, and you're at least keeping it from spreading. Ideally, you're shrinking it, you're working towards eradication if possible. Control means we work on it a fair amount, but we can't say that we're actually stopping its spread regionally, at least not yet. There were lower levels of partial control, et cetera, too, which is our, we work on it sometimes, but, there's only so much we can do because it's pretty widespread. So this is saying that leafy spurge, foxtail, rest harrow, Dalmatian toadflax, Scotch thistle, which I didn't even know was down there, Canada thistle, limonium, sea lavender, and devil's thorn are plants that the counties have committed to. Some of these are containment targets, some of these are control targets. And you can see we've got the CDFA rating. The W just means it's on the noxious weed list, and the Calipsi ratings for these. So that's like I say, a living list. It's something that the that CDFA and Calipsi ideally will keep working with the regions on. And some plants may leave that list if either they're too far out of control or actually they've been eradicated. Some plants may get added to that list as resources grow and new things are found and worked on. So the goal, the objective, what we're encouraging is for regions to take that set of regional priority species and to make sure they're all mapped, ideally in CalFlora, because that's a single source that we can all share and see what's going on at the landscape level across the entire region. So to have all known populations recorded in CalFlora, and then secondly, to make sure that the management status of field in the CalFlora record for those species is kept current, because that's a way to tell, yep, that's being managed, that one's not being managed, that one was managed 2 years ago, but wasn't managed this year. That allows for the bottom one here, be able to report status on an annual basis. So ideally, you've got the full set of, these are all the populations of the regional priority species that we know about, and we know their status in terms of management. We're trying to manage as many as possible, and we're tracking that by record keeping in CalFlora, ideally, so that you can, Calipsi can, or Curiosagata at CDFA can, anyone in the region can look at that full picture of what's happening with those populations. So topic number 2 of 2, let me switch here for a moment to how do you control weeds? How do you know the best way to control weeds? Well, there are a lot of experts out there. Cooperative Extension, folks like Royce are an incredible resource, and thankfully it sounds like they're finally getting some more money for some more positions. How can we aggregate a lot of that good information and make it available to people as a resource through best management practices? And so we had a project, first phase of a project, and we're currently in the second phase, funded by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation and undertaken with a lot of experts, with UC Cooperative Extension being kind of the lead set of experts, but then also the UC IPM program out of Davis, helping to put the best management practices into an online format that can be accessed based on a particular user's situation. So that's the weed cut tool. So how do things vary situationally? So before I go into the tool, I just wanted to, and this may or may not have to do with a DPR quiz. One of the weeds that we have in Northern California and also in Southern California are sea lavender, limonium species, Limonium ramosissimum and Limonium duriesculum. And this is an example of a weed where there are lots of ways of controlling it. Primarily, when we can, we spray herbicide on it. In some cases, like in Marin County, where they don't want herbicide used and there's not a ton of limonium, we're hand pulling. A lot of expensive contractor work, but a lot of good volunteer follow-up. For small populations of young seedlings, we use flaming with a propane torch, loud and smelly. And in some smaller infestations where there is a lot of volunteer work and they don't want to use herbicides, tarping has actually been somewhat successful. So those are a bunch of techniques that have been used on this weed. And so that's an example of how multiple techniques can be used for a given plant, depending on the situation. So one of the first things that the project did was to collect data from a lot of land managers across the state on how effective they found particular approaches for particular kinds of species. So not to go into too much detail here, but the columns are a type of species, and this is by no means all of it. This is just an example. And then these rows going across are various approaches. So pulling with hand tools, digging with hand tools, pulling with large equipment, and how effective, this graph is saying that, a fair number of people found that pulling annuals and perennial seedlings with hand tools was pretty darn effective, whereas pulling herbaceous perennials was not, for instance. And that was done in both Northern California and Southern California. So those were all compiled into best management practices for, I think it was 21 different weed management approaches, weed control approaches, and we'll see those in a minute. 21 techniques. So there is a big fat PDF on our website that you can download for free. Also worked with USDA ARS and CDFA on biocontrols for 20 different weed species. So those are contained in this as well. So the weed cut web tool, and here's the URL up here. This is what the homepage looks like, is basically those BMPs, but filterable by a particular plant type and situation. So we run through the tools that are in there, and then we can take a quick look at the filters that are available. So biological control, burning, competitive planting, cutting with bladed hand tools, cutting with chainsaws, cutting with pruners, loppers, shears, and hand saws, cutting with string trimmers and brush cutters, flaming, girdling, grazing, that's a big one. Hard to fit all of that into one section, as you can imagine. Grubbing with grub hose, mechanized tillage, mowing and cutting with larger equipment, mulching, scraping with scuffle hose, severing roots, solarizing, steaming, stump grinding, tarping, whole plant removal with hand tools or just by hand, and whole plant removal with large equipment. So I mentioned the filters. So if you come in as a user, currently we don't have the, so I mentioned we're in phase 2. Phase 2 will include a couple of things, but one of the things is it will include an actual plant list. You can say I'm working with yellow star thistle, but for now you have to define the plant type and then your site characteristics. And so here's a list of site characteristics over here: level of tolerable disturbance, how big is your target area, how accessible is it to vehicles, what's the slope, ground condition, what kind of habitat are you working in, the existing desirable plant cover versus the targeted invasive plant cover. And what Weed Cut will do is when you provide it with the information on your plant type and your site characteristics, it will then spit out the best techniques that fit those situations. And they're based on efficacy ratings, which are based on expert opinion, single season reduction in cover, and associated propagule production for the technique and the site condition. And for instance, excellent is more than 95% control, good is 80 to 95, et cetera. It's rare that I even see a good, let alone an excellent, because it's just rare that you have that easy a job. So here's an example. Here's a bunch of filters that have been selected. They show up on the screen like that, so because you can hit an X and change it. But I believe I did this for a broom, long seed life, high resprouting shrub. As I said, no excellent results, no good results, but under fair, 50 to 80% control, we've got cutting with a chainsaw, grazing, and whole plant removal with large equipment. And then you can drill down to each of those and get the BMPs. Then I reduced the area and said, we've only got, where's the area on here? Target area is less than an acre now. I think before it was 1 to 10. The resprouting is now only moderate, and we can't take that, we can't tolerate much disturbance. Well, that's going to ditch the large equipment. So we've still got the chainsaw and we've still got the grazing, but now we've got cutting with string trimmers and brush cutters, we've got severing roots, and we've got whole plant removal with hand tools. So you can see that the factors basically affect which proposed tools you can take a look at. I mentioned the biocontrols. We don't need to go through all of these species, but these are the individual species that have biocontrol sections written up in the tool. And the second phase that we're involved in now, so DPR made a second grant to follow up the first grant. The first grant was entirely on non-chemical control methods. Probably should have made that clear. That's what all those 21 control techniques were. The second phase is to add in the chemical-based methods. And in large part, that will be taking this book, which came out, I don't know, 2013, I think. Jody Tomaso and a whole bunch of other folks put this together to kind of compile, which chemicals and which application techniques and which non-chemical approaches map into each species. So we will be taking this information, updating it, and integrating it into the weed cut tool so that you can look at the tool and say either, hey, I only use non-chemical methods given my situation, or I want to have a full IPM approach and I want to use all the options, show me what's going to be effective. So that's going to be a big task to try to integrate it all into the tool and have it, have the output be sensible. But I have confidence in our team and the UC IPM folks for designing that. So that's what I've got for today. There's a lot more going on. Calipsi is busy in Sacramento right now, trying to make sure that some of the budget surplus gets pointed at weed management, since that's going to be an important part of fulfilling the goals for things like the 30 by 30 initiative that commits California to protecting 30% of its lands and waters by 2030. And conserving those for the long term is going to mean controlling the weeds on those lands as well as elsewhere that could move onto those lands. So we're trying to make sure that lawmakers understand the implications of not funding things like the weed management area program that do stay on top of things. So lots going on. Thank you so much for your attention, and the great meeting to be having today. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Doug? I do see a hand up. I hoping Mel, you can unmute that person. I don't know if I've got access to that, but in the meantime, I do have a question in the Q&A. Has Calipsi had any discussions with resource agencies about allowing weed work to fulfill mitigation requirements?
To some degree, in the resource conservation, I think the RCIS, somebody will jump in and remind me what that stands for, but that seems like a really good avenue for having advanced mitigation pay for weed work, especially the distributed EDRR type work. But that's been a difficult thing to push for so far, because there's a really strong historical connection between mitigation being very much one-to-one, in the same kind of habitat or right next to the project that's causing the take. So that's kind of a longer term battle to encourage that broader landscape level thinking, to say, hey, if we're going to be, expanding lanes on a freeway over here and causing some damage, that maybe the most effective thing we can do is to work on, weeds X and Y at various places around the county. That would be a really productive use of these mitigation funds. So those conversations have happened a little bit, but we don't really have the lobbying workforce to have them in a big way. But certainly with the new invasive species council now being codified, the interagency council at the state level with CFA and the Natural Resources Agency and Caltrans and others at the table, there's a venue for bringing things like that up. So I very much encourage people to get on the listserv. I think it's through CDFA, through the Invasive Species Council, so that you're notified when the quarterly meetings are. And then there's an opportunity for public comment to bring those kind of things forward. That really helps, because I say a lot of things, and I think sooner at some point it's, people can only hear so much from one person. So having lots of other voices from lots of organizations around the state saying these things can be really important. Likewise with the Coastal Conservancy strategic plan revision that's happening right now, their 5-year revision. It's a really good opportunity to get in there and say, hey, you should fund invasive plant management projects, and you should fund stewardship projects over time.
Andrea, you can go ahead and ask your question. I unmute yourself with your hand raised.
Sorry, I didn't have a question. I didn't know I hit that.
Okay, no problem.
Just waving.
Right. Any other questions for Doug?
Yeah, hi, this is Stephanie Stark, Santa Barbara County. Thank you very much for coming today. Doug, I did have a question. Is there much interaction between Calipsi and like Cal Fire, or much discussion about weeds and fire suppression and how weeds play a part in the cycle of fire? Is there any collaboration? But perhaps through this council you were discussing, the Invasive Species Council.
Yeah, I think the council is a great place for that. One of the things we're doing in the short term is we have a bill in Sacramento that we've worked on in partnership with a couple of park districts, the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District and the East Bay Regional Park District, on ecologically sound vegetation management is what it's called. And it creates a pot at the Wildlife Conservation Board, and ideally gets funding into that pot this year. We'll see if it's successful, to fund projects that are basically weed control projects that are done for fuel reduction or other ways to mitigate wildfire risk. And the goal being, I mean, it's trying not to be too pointedly saying, hey, you know, a lot of times Cal Fire and others, when you clear a bunch of vegetation or do other things for mitigating wildfire risk, you're doing it in a way that's spreading weeds, or at least not taking advantage of the opportunity to control weeds. And so we'd like to look at projects that use semi-innovative approaches to do both at the same time, to protect habitat, ideally enhance habitat at the same time as you're reducing fire risk. So some of the things that have been proposed are like, you know, roadside mowing, as opposed to just doing that once to try to get all the biomass at the end of the year, even though you're spreading a bunch of seeds. Try to do that 3 times during the year, and do it in a way that favors early, maybe you're even planting early season forbs or something, so that you can gradually change the mix of what grows there, so that it's more fire resistant and requires less maintenance. So you know, that's really hard to scale, and Caltrans has all its challenges doing roadsides, and Cal Fire has all its challenges trying to meet goals to just really reduce vegetation. So this is a way of starting with maybe smaller projects that are testing out ways of doing things that could be better in the long run, and then seeing if there are ways to mainstream that eventually. So in answer to your question, do we have a direct line to Cal Fire? Not so much. I do know that CMPS, the Native Plant Society, is talking with them, and we talk with CMPS. So there are conversations being had, and that's definitely a concern.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, with our weed management area meetings, we're always trying to just include more partners and people to collaborate with, and includes Caltrans. We've had them come to a couple of our meetings, but it might be helpful too to have some folks there from Cal Fire, just so that kind of there's just an understanding of how weeds play a part in the cycle of fire. So yeah,
Definitely.
yeah.
One of the special sessions at this year's Calipsi Symposium will be on the ecologically sound vegetation management. If anyone's interested in that bill, it's AB 2610, which you can look up online just under California bills.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And then the fire came up in 2 of our presentations this morning. So it's on everybody's mind right now.
Yeah, for good reason.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I'm not seeing any other questions for Doug, so thank you for joining us. We are a little bit over, but I still want to give everyone about just a couple minutes if you need to get up, grab some water, stretch your legs. So I'm hoping that we can just take 2 minutes and be back and start at 10:32 with Dr. Stephen Fenimore. So if anybody needs to get up and go, stretch your legs, go ahead and go do that now.
You need to allow me to share my screen.
Mel, can you? that?
Yeah, I'll take care of it. Okay, Dr. Fenimore, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay.
Okay, I can see it just fine.
Good.
All right, so it's been a couple minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started with our next presenter. We have Dr. Stephen Fenimore from UC Cooperative Extension, UC Davis, and he's going to be talking with us today about soil, I guess, application of steam for weed management. So excited to hear what you have to say, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks for the invitation. Good morning to everybody. What I'm going to talk about, I hope this is relevant. I am based in Salinas, and I primarily work on vegetable crops and strawberries. I do not work on wildlands, but a lot of this, so I'm going to give you sort of a very extensive overview of how you treat soil with steam. So there's two methods of using steam for weed management. There's basically cooking the weed seeds or the weed propagules in the soil. And then there's also, as a previous speaker showed you, you can use steam to destroy the foliage of weeds. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to just talk about the soil aspects, which uses a lot more energy. But here's what we do. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the physics. There's a lot of physics involved in this. So it basically uses what you're doing when you treat soil with steam is you're simply using a heat source, which is like a diesel or a propane flame, and you're vaporizing water and you're injecting water into the soil, and it condenses and it releases the heat energy into the soil particle, and it kills the pest, whether that's a disease propagule or a weed seed, because it doesn't just control weed seeds. I'm going to talk about methods of application. You know, you've got lots of different situations. You may be treating a pile of soil. So those types of situations are probably going to be more relevant. This is not going to be applicable to a 1,000-acre rangeland. I always get a lot of questions about microbial effects. Aren't you sterilizing the soil? Let's just stop one thing. We're not sterilizing soil. We're pasteurizing it. We're not over steaming it. You're wasting money. You're burning too much fuel. There is a selectivity level of application of steam, which does not damage the soil, but will kill the soil pests. So I'm going to make some recommendations at the end. So this is out of a very old University of California Extension manual that was published in 1957. And it's a gem edited by Ken Baker. And he's got this thermometer in here, which shows how much steam you need to kill various pests. And even though a lot of this research was done in the 1930s and 40s, it's pretty good information. So here's what you're doing, and this thought process is relevant to solarization as well. I'm going to turn on my laser pointer here. So if you treat soil with a high temperature, you can do it very quickly. So this is the temperature on this axis, and this is the time in minutes on this axis. So if you go with low temperatures, you need a lot of time. And that's solarization. That's why you may want to go 4 to 6 weeks. Whereas with steam, you can literally do the job in a few minutes. So what is the objective of soil treatment with steam? So what you're trying to do is raise the soil temperature to 150 to 160 degrees for 20 minutes. That is called the dwell time. It's basically the cooking time. It's very much like cooking food. You have to achieve a certain level of temperature, internal temperature, to get the desired effect. Whether you're cooking a turkey or cooking soil, the concepts are very similar. You can control pathogens. I know that's not the objective here, but you can control Pythium and Verticillium. This is how it works. This is what I meant by selectivity. You can kill pests like pathogens pretty easily compared to the beneficials. You do not want to kill the nitrifiers. They're pretty hardy bunch, fortunately. But if you kill the nitrifiers, then you can end up with ammonium toxicity. So you do not want to sterilize the soil. So we're going to pasteurize it. Not too hot, not too cold. It's just like Goldilocks. You know, getting to 180 degrees is too hot. 140 might be too cool to kill the bad guys. So you want it just right, just like Goldilocks prefers her porridge. So these are strategies to increase your efficiency. And I don't know what all you have available to you in terms of techniques and machinery and that sort of thing. But there's a great advantage to being able to blend, physically mix steam with soil. And I'll tell you why. You know, the other idea is to limit the soil volume to just what you need to treat. If you're just trying to control weeds, then you can just go in the soil surface, maybe 2, maybe 3 inches deep. If you're going for pathogens, then you need to go much deeper. So we have been working with in cropland, we've been working with automatic applicators because some of the traditional methods of steam application are really labor intensive and they're backbreaking, quite honestly. So some other strategies that people have been working on and I've worked on are using materials like mustard seed meal, which is basically the idea is to try to induce a biofumigant effect. And then there is a technique which came from Italy called use of quicklime. Quicklime is basically a concrete component. And so the Italians found that when you combine quicklime with steam, you know, the quicklime, if you pour concrete on a very cold morning, you'll touch the drying concrete and it's warm. That's an exothermic reaction. It's releasing heat and it's also releasing CO2. But the quicklime, by co-injecting it with steam, you end up, you know, the idea is to allow you to decrease your fuel consumption. So steam moves in soil by convection. Conduction is where basically you heat one object and it transmits through the mass of the soil. And this is very, very slow. Convection is really what you want to do with steam. And so some things I've learned very recently to understand is that what you want is a very dry steam, and that may defy common sense because steam is water. But when you heat steam up very hot, it does not have water droplets in it. It is a pure gas, and that can be injected into the soil, and it cools much more slowly. And why do you want it to cool slowly? You want better transmission of the heat through the soil, because what you want it to do, you want distribution of the steam before it condenses, because the condensation is the critical process, the critical step in that when the steam vapor comes in contact with the cold soil, it condenses and it releases that heat, which is carried from the propane flame or the diesel flame. If you don't blend steam with soil, it moves very, very slowly. And so in my research, we've looked at how do we speed things up. So we compared just static steams, soil that was just not moving versus mixing. So we did this in a very cheap concrete mixer. We put sand in and we measured the temperatures. And this is what we found. I'm going to need my laser again. So this is static soil. So the soil is just sitting there. And so on the bottom, we have time. The soil at the surface got hot. So this is the temperature. It got quite hot. But the deeper soil did not, because within 60 minutes, it wasn't enough time for it to get hot. So not too happy with that. In 60 minutes, we want to have some effect. So if, on the other hand, if we're blending steam with soil, turning the cement mixer on and injecting steam at the same time, we get very rapid heating of the soil. Why is that? Well, the boxes, the images on the bottom, where you inject it at just one point, it takes a long time for it to sort of radiate out. And what steam is doing is this moving in a sphere. That's what Baker says in his 1957 book. It moves every direction. But that takes hours to really cover very much space. When you blend, you have a lot of little, very tiny spheres, and they're all coming together. They coalesce, and this allows you to steam very rapidly because none of the steam particles have to travel very far. And so you literally can heat, instead of heating soil up in hours, you heat it up in minutes, or really even seconds. So preparing soil for steaming, the ideal soil moisture is near planting. You squeeze the soil and it crumbles easily. Some of the things I might say here about moisture is maybe a little contradictory, so ask questions. But moist soil conducts heat better than dry soil. But the problem with moist soil is that it takes more energy to heat it up. So it's there's a bit of art to this. So weed control is better under moist conditions than under dry conditions. And that's because the weed seeds are swollen with moisture in their vacuoles. So the weed seed are very much alive, even though they may not be germinating. And so it's easier to kill them when they're moist than when they're dry. But it takes more energy. But it's a lot easier physically. It's a lot easier to steam soil that's a bit dry rather than too wet. So as you can see, there's some subtle nuances here. So this is some research from Italy. This is a sandy loam soil. And what the Italians wanted to know is, what is the ideal soil moisture for steaming? And so this is a sandy loam soil, and they have a whole series of these graphs, but I'm showing you the sandy loam. So here's the water content, the percentage of field capacity. And so what they're showing, their data show, is around 45 to 50% of field capacity is the ideal soil moisture. They have the most rapid heating of the soil. That's what we want to do. The more rapidly you heat the soil, the less fuel you're using, the less money you're spending. So clay soils, where I tend to find more disease problems, and where in organic fields, highly fertile fields, they tend to have a lot of soil pests. And so clods are a sort of an obstacle. But I have seen in this situation some very good soil preparation. If you Tiny clods are not so much of a problem. Things like that are about the size of pea gravel. If you have big clods, they're a problem because you're going to have pests, you're going to have weed seed in the inside of the clod, and the heat is not going to penetrate it and control it. So a very tradition, I mean, this is sheet steaming in a greenhouse. People have been doing this for 100 years or more. It's rather simple. One of the more simple methods. It's also a lot of work. Physically, you have to lay all that tarp, and it takes a long time. I'll explain. So if this is the sheet, which is basically like a heat-resistant tarp that you cover the soil, so you're injecting the steam under the tarp, and it's going into the soil. So we want to go 12 inches deep. So when we steam soil from the top, every single bit of that steam, every single vapor particle has to be transferred through that soil surface. And what we're doing, we're going to do some damage to that shallow soil because it could take 6 or 8 hours to reach that 12-inch depth. And so we're really going to heavily steam that shallow area. It's not the most efficient. It may be a relatively simple method, but in my opinion, it's not the best. This is a mobile steam applicator that I got through some grant funds, and we still have it and we're still using it. It's basically just a mobile little rig, self-contained with the water, with the tank on the back. And this is the actual steam generator. That's the fuel tank. Very, very simple machine. And it's got a road trailer. We have experimented with many, many different types of steam application methods. This is a steam blanket from Syntex, which is a Canadian company in Manitoba, Winnipeg, I believe it is. And they don't make this so much for steaming for soil, for agricultural purposes. They sell these up in the Arctic areas where they're exploring for oil, so that in the wintertime they can thaw out soil and take their backhoe and quickly dig a ditch. But it works. You know, they're well set up. This is polypropylene material. It kind of looks like a burlap, but it's a very strong material. And so we've done that. You can apply it steam through buried pipes. Heck of a lot of work. That's what you can use. Spike hoses. This is a method that we developed. Syntex made these. They told us they would make them any way we want. They look like a fire hose, but we had steel spikes on them, so we could inject the steam in the soil at about 8 inches deep. That works, but trust me, it's a lot of work. We've used augers in almond orchards. We're injecting the steam through the auger. We've got a device here that we bought. It's called a downhole steam applicator. It will transmit it into this rotating shaft of this auger. This worked quite well. Unfortunately, we couldn't treat a big enough area to really benefit almond trees, but as far as the steam application method, it worked quite well. This is an Italian machine. This is called the Sterilizer machine we brought in for testing a number of years ago. And basically it uses that set of spikes to inject it in the soil. There are a number of European companies that do similar things. This is the Celli Bioflash machine from Italy, used in greenhouses, but you can also use it in an open field. And what this machine is doing, they got a rototill on it they're releasing quicklime, calcium oxide is what it is, into the soil, and then they're injecting steam right behind it. And so they get a benefit, co-heating effect of the, some of this is written in Italian, but the steam complementing the chemical release. So the thing I love about steam is there's a lot of flexibility. This is MSD. There's a number of different companies in Europe. There's also Simon, which sells a very similar machine. What they're doing, the machine just walks down the field, and it has this hood that injects steam onto the bed. This is commonly done for lettuce in Germany. This is a machine where I built. I'm gonna have to turn on my laser so I can show you a movie. We're injecting steam into a lettuce bed. That's about all I need to show you of that. So it works. That's what I'll show you right here. I don't really have to explain. This is the no steam on the left and the steam on the right. This is carrots, and we've only treated a band where the carrots are. This is the new machine that we've built and that I'm going to be running next week. We're going to be demonstrating this also at a field day here in Salinas on June 8th at the Hartnell East campus. Basically, we're treating beds. We have also tested this in strawberries. This was a cooperation with Ryder, one of the growers for Driscoll strawberries, and this was paid for by the Propane Council. Worked quite well. Heat soil very quickly because we were blending steam with the soil. So that's what we've repeatedly seen, is that when we blend the steam with the soil, that we get very, very quick heating. So these are my takeaways, and I think this is my last slide. Inject a lot of steam into the soil very rapidly and then blend it. Insulate the soil temperature for a few minutes. That insulation really helps. And the idea is to maintain labor use efficiency, because so many of these old techniques, the tarping techniques, are quite labor intensive. They're a lot of work. So just a suggestion, looking for simple ideas, is simply to use a rototiller and combine it with a steam injector. I've given this talk to small growers, and this is my suggestion. This was a rather large operation. This is like a 12-foot reverse tiller. It works, but it was absolutely huge and took a lot of power. I always get a lot of questions about soil microbes. If you pasteurize, you will not damage them. Do not want to hurt the nitrifying bacteria. They convert ammonium to nitrate. If you keep it around 158, you will not hurt them. They will recover rather quickly and you'll be in business. So steam kills pathogens and weeds. It can be used as a component in a multi-tactic soil disinfestation program. You don't always have to use fumigants. So I hope that's useful to you. I realize my focus is on pretty intensive crops, but so I guess I'd be curious to know how you all want to proceed with that, or how you might use some of those methods. Up to you.
Thank you. Yeah, does anybody have any thoughts about how this could be applicable to any agricultural operations, or even, maybe if there's some county or state agencies that have public lands, or if you have any questions, please either raise your hand or type them into the chat, or question and answer.
I know that in Norway, I'm working with a company from Norway, and they've been using a stationary steamer because in Norway, when they make a new highway, they have very strict laws about movement of soil, and they're concerned about invasive species spreading around. And so they're developing a business, and they've developed a technology for treating piles of soil, and it moves through this steam applicator, stationary steam applicator. The applicator doesn't move, but the soil is blended inside the machine, and so it spews it out in a pile. Relevant in that case, perhaps to here. I haven't really heard anybody talk about that here, but okay. Does it look like I've struck a chord?
Yeah, it's definitely very, I'm very interested in how we might be able to utilize this in the future. There was a comment in the chat about injection into soil after herbicide treatment of monoculture of a noxious weed like yellow star thistle. That could definitely be an option.
Yeah, I would imagine we can kill. Most of the weed seed are pretty susceptible to this because it's really something they don't see. We can even kill clover seed, which is something I've treated clover seed with methyl bromide and had trouble with it because it has a highly it's an impermeable seed coat. Whereas when you treat it with heat, it has a little waxy plug on the seed. It's a very tiny structure, and you actually melt it, and so it increases the susceptibility of the seed to control. So it's different, and in terms of pest management, different is good. Variation, yeah.
Definitely. I think this is really interesting. Then there was a question about what about seeds like Spanish broom or hard surface seeds?
Yeah, that's a legume. I haven't done that, but that's, a lot of this, this would need to be tried. I would imagine, I've seen that the Spanish broom seed, that would be tough. I would have to try it. So I simply don't know. The ratio of water to treatment area that Holly is asking. Well, I'll tell you the number. I don't want to scare anybody in the drought year. We were using in strawberries, we were using equivalent of about 10,000 gallons per treated area, per treated acre. And we were actually only treating about 70% of the area. I think we can probably go a little bit lower than that, but it used a lot of water, and that I won't mislead anybody. That's why this is technique. It tends to be used on limited areas, not something you treat 1,000-acre fields with. It's strategic, a strategic option. Where it fits and where it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. So I hope that answers the question, Holly. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay.
All right. Well, if anybody has any, please, you can always email myself and we can get those over and get them answered for you. And thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us, and that was really an interesting presentation. Thank you.
We have I'll do an advertisement if I can. We have a technology field day in Salinas on June 8th. If anybody wants to see any of this stuff, we'll be showing it. Okay.
Great. Yeah, and if you could maybe send me a flyer or something along those lines, and we can get those distributed. Oh, and it looks like we do actually have one more question here in the Q&A. How economically viable is steam compared to fumigating, say, for a large-scale strawberry producer? Do you see steam becoming a more available tool for soil pasteurization in the future?
Well, methyl bromide right now in the strawberry nurseries is about between $4,500 and $5,000 an acre. And I think, probably the cheapest and the best we could probably do with steam on a large scale basis going a foot deep would be, somewhere between, 6,000 and 8,000. Of course, now diesel is $5, red diesel is $5.50 a gallon, or at least the last time I bought it. So that price may increase, but it's going to be, about 10 to 15, 20% more expensive than fumigation. Is it going to be more common? Is it feasible? After the early morning call I had with a Dutch manufacturer, I'm pretty optimistic that it can have some impact, because there's a new machine I just learned about today that they're using commercially in Holland, which sounds extremely interesting, and we're going to try to test it here in the near future, like in the next couple of months. So there's a lot going on, both in Europe and in South Korea, and in Norway. So anyway, thanks for your time. Okay.
Thank you. All right, so we will move on to our final item on the agenda, or the second to final item, I guess, pesticide safety and vertebrate pest control. We do have Julia, and then I actually don't think it's Molly, so I think
We'll have
there might
Noah
be
on.
another. Okay, Noah, perfect. So they will be presenting. They're both with the Santa Barbara County Ag Commissioner's Office. So I will go ahead and pass it over to you.
All right, good morning, everybody. We have a fair bit of content I'm going to try and get through today. So just want to mention, if you have any questions, later on or after today, feel free to give our office a call, and we're here for you as a resource. First thing I want to talk about, we've got to define our terms and make sure we're on the same page about what a pesticide is. A lot of times people think of a pesticide as just an insecticide or something of that nature. It's really any substance that's intended for pest control, and California also considers adjuvants to be a pesticide. Organic products are pesticides. So just something to be aware of. If you're using it for pest control, whether it's on weeds or anything else, that is a pesticide. One of the key things we look at if we're identifying a pesticide is to look for that EPA registration number. That's a really easy clue that you're dealing with a pesticide product, but it's not always going to tell you, because there are some products out there that are becoming more commonly used that are exempt from registration. They are laid out in a very similar way. They list active ingredients, mixing instructions, and they are intended for pest control purposes. And in California, regulations for employee protection still apply for these products that are non-EPA registered. This is just an overview of what we're going to be going through today, so we'll reference back to this as we go. And we're going to start with talking about personal protective equipment. It's an area where we see a lot of misunderstanding or people having a hard time complying with the rules. So it's a really important one, and one we want to make sure that everybody gets right. So if you have employees, you've got some obligations to them with protective equipment. You need to provide their PPE, and you need to check that they're wearing it correctly. It needs to be cleaned, inspected, discarded if it's, you know, in bad shape. And it needs to be stored correctly. You don't want it intermixed with personal clothing. You don't want it mixed with, you know, dirty gloves in the cab of your truck. And importantly, make sure that employees aren't taking it home with them. It should stay at the work site or on the work vehicle. Really basic requirement comes up for pretty much any pesticide in California. You need to wear chemical resistant gloves and protective eyewear. There are some pesticide labels that don't list those as requirements, but in California, you pretty much always need to be wearing those, as well as long sleeve shirts, long pants, shoes with socks. That's your bare minimum. There's also a coverall requirement if you're handling pesticides with a danger or warning signal alert. And chemical resistant gloves, they need to be of a certain thickness. We're not talking about the little disposable gloves that you see like in a medical setting. They need to have some thickness and durability to them. Here's an example of something we commonly see with applicators. It does have the long pants and shoes, that's good, but no sleeves, no gloves. And you know, we also see a lot of times people have their safety glasses, but they're pushed up on their head, or they have one glove on, one glove off. So you need to have it, and it needs to be worn correctly. The eyewear too, it needs to be wrap around safety glasses, not just sunglasses or something the employees brought from home. We're going to talk a little bit about pesticide labeling next. So pesticide use has to be in accordance with the label. And if you're using a restricted material, have a restricted materials permit, you've got to follow its requirements. What we always say, and a great way to think about it, the label is the law. So whatever is written there, you got to follow it. And all of the US EPA registered pesticide labels have the same language. It's a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. So before you use any pesticide, you want to take the time to really read over the label, make sure you understand all the directions. That's tough. Some of them are pretty long and complex, but it's really going to set you up for a successful application. And you know, if you have a label where it's confusing, you're having a hard time understanding a section of it, give us a call. We're happy to look at it with you and make sure you know what you need to know there. So a little bit more on the pesticide labeling. There are pesticides that'll have the same active ingredient, but have very different label requirements. So a good example of that is products that have glyphosate, so Roundup and similar products. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of different glyphosate products, and you can't go, oh, this is glyphosate, it's all the same, I'm going to use the same rate. You need to read each individual label and make sure you understand any restrictions there. You want to make sure you're reading it ahead of time. You might need to be doing extra prep. You might need to be checking your site conditions, doing things to prep your equipment. A big thing that a lot of labels require is calibrating your equipment. This is something that not too many people do, and it's a really helpful thing to make sure you know how to do it and that you're doing it on a regular basis. The calibration is going to make sure you're using the right amount of pesticides for the label rate. It's going to protect the health of the applicator, the environment, using the right amount for your target pest, and it's preventing waste, which is expensive. So common problems we see are applying to a site or crop that's not listed on the label, applying over the maximum rate. Remember, you can use a lower rate than what's listed unless it's specifically prohibited. But you can't go over that maximum rate. And not using protective equipment that's required by the label. Another big one is allowing pesticides to drift off site onto non-targets. Something that we're going to cover that I don't think too many people are aware of is the prescribed database, which the California Department of Pesticide Regulation has set up for the protection of endangered species. So prescribed is short for a very long acronym here: Pesticide Regulation, Endangered Species, Custom Real-Time Internet Bulletin Engine. It's kind of a mouthful. You can use it through their website. They also have a mobile app. And what you do is you'll put in information on pesticide that you're going to use in your planned application area. And it will create a custom report for you that'll tell you about the endangered, also includes threatened species that are in an area, and list any application restrictions that might apply if you're going to work in that area. So this is just a little example of what would be included in one of those reports. So in the top left, we've got some of the endangered species and threatened species found in the state. I selected an area of the county and some herbicides, 2,4-D. And so it's telling me for that selected area and those products that there are restrictions on using those herbicides in occupied habitat, and there's restrictions about working near that area and preventing drift. So this is just a really general example. It's going to be very different depending on what product you're using, what area you're working in. And in many cases, a pesticide isn't going to have any specific restrictions. But if you're working in sensitive sites particularly, it's good to know about this lookup and to check in on it before you make applications. All right, moving on to pesticide handler training. If you have employees, you need to have a written training program, and it needs to cover a very specific list of training points. And it needs to cover all the pesticides or active ingredients that are going to be used by the handler. That training needs to be done first before they are handling that pesticide. And you got to keep those records for 2 years, retrain annually. And if you're adding a new pesticide mid-year, then you'll want to do a mid-year training. It's also important, this training's got to be in a manner that the employee understands. So if you have Spanish-speaking employees, you need to set up to have training for them in Spanish. We have training forms available, so it makes it pretty easy for you. If you want to use our forms, you'll definitely know all of the topics that need to be covered. You're free to use others or make your own, but we always recommend that people make use of the standard forms that we have. Common problems we see: people do a training once but don't retrain annually. They train on some pesticides but not everything. They have some written records about training but not the full list of training requirements. And, you know, unfortunately, we hear pretty often, we ask an employee if they've been trained, we hear, I don't know, or I can't remember. They may have had a training, but if it's not sticking with them, then it's not an effective training. Next up, we're going to talk about the availability of labeling during an application. So you need to have a copy of the label at your use site for every pesticide that's being used there. And that includes any supplemental labeling, any specialized labeling. It is okay to have a digital copy of the label, but I'd caution you on that. If you're working in an area that doesn't have good service, if your cell phone runs out of battery, or even just being able to pull up the correct label that actually reflects the product you're using, that all can be kind of tricky. So probably a better practice in most situations is to have print it out, have a binder, keep that updated, and then you won't have any issues if you're out somewhere with no service or a dead phone. So here's a picture that shows, you know, some of the issues we run into with labeling. This container's been transported around quite a bit, been exposed to moisture, and there is a label there, but good luck reading it. You know, major problem, of course, would be having no label at all. Sometimes people have the front page or part of the label, part of it's ripped off the pesticide container, or just, you know, leaving it behind or leaving it on another truck. We're going to talk a little bit about service containers, what they are and how they need to be labeled. So a service container, it's any kind of container that's not the original manufacturer's pesticide container. And it's, you know, if you're using it to store pesticides, whether it's a concentrate or a dilute mix. Doesn't apply to application equipment when it's in use. So it's having to do with transporting that non-original container. You have to have it labeled, who's responsible for that container, what's in it, and what that signal word is. So here's a example of backpack sprayers that are being transported with pesticide mix in them. There's no label on them at all. Sometimes there's a service container that's labeled with one thing, but it actually has something else in there. That's a real problem because then you've got kind of a mystery mix. What we really don't want to hear is if we ask somebody about a service container, is that I don't know what's in it, I didn't mix it, this got left on the truck. The whole idea here with the labeling is if you have this in a vehicle and there's an accident or a spill, or a person gets exposed, there needs to be some way to identify what's in that container. And it's really crucial if you're in a situation where you've got first responders on the scene. All right, we're also going to cover emergency medical care. So medical care, you need to plan this out in advance. You don't want to be caught off guard when there's a medical problem or pesticide exposure. And you need to make sure that a medical facility that you take an employee to is capable of handling a pesticide emergency. So call ahead, talk to somebody there, make sure that they're the right kind of facility. There needs to be information posted at the work site or on a work vehicle that directs employees to where they can receive that medical care and a phone number to reach those facilities. And it's your responsibility if you have employees and there appears to be a pesticide-related illness or exposure, that employee needs to be taken for medical care immediately. And somebody else needs to drive them there. You don't want somebody who's suffering an illness or symptoms to be driving themselves. And when we say information needs to be posted, that means it needs to be visible and not, in a binder tucked away. It means up on a bulletin board or with work vehicles, we often see a paper taped up on the back window. Wherever it is, it needs to be somewhere where employees know how to find it, and it's right there in plain sight. Some common issues we see is there's a sign that's been put up, but nothing's filled out on it. Or it was filled out at one point, but you can't read anything on it anymore. Just putting call 911 is not enough. You need to have specific information. And even if it's written on, a piece of cardboard or a napkin or whatever, that's fine. It doesn't need to be a store-bought sign, but it does need to list those facilities and their addresses. And along those lines, we're going to talk about handler decontamination. So today we're kind of focused on non-agricultural settings. If there's anybody listening in today that works in production ag, the requirements are a little bit different. So just try and keep that in mind. We're not talking about the production ag requirements today. So decontamination rules for non-ag are applying to employees that are using pesticides that have a danger or warning signal word. It's a good practice to have decontamination supplies available regardless of the signal word, but that's the limitations of that regulation. Decontamination, it needs to be within 100 feet of where you're mixing and loading the pesticide. And employers need to provide water, soap, single-use towels, and a clean pair of coveralls for the employee to change into. And you want to have the supplies together, make a decontamination kit. Last thing you want is somebody who's got pesticides spilled on their skin, wandering around trying to find the different things they need to clean up. So some issues that we see are people with hand sanitizer but no soap, using cloth towels or rags or an old t-shirt instead of single-use paper towels. or just not having the decontamination supplies at or near the mix and load site. So we're going to talk a little bit about pesticide storage and transportation. So for all pesticides, they need to be stored in the locked enclosure, or if you're actively using them and they need to be out of the lockup, then there needs to be somebody there maintaining control over those containers. For storage areas, they need to be posted if you've got warning or danger pesticides. Again, it's kind of a nice idea to post it for any pesticide, but that's the requirement in regulation. And for pesticide storage, these requirements are the same whether it's a stationary storage site at a building or if it's storage on a vehicle. So when you're transporting pesticides on a vehicle, don't have them in the passenger compartment. Don't store them in a spot with food or feed. They need to be in their own area where you're not putting people or food at risk of contamination. You also want to make sure that the containers are secured so that you're not risking spillage onto the vehicle or even worse, off of the vehicle. So loose pesticide containers just rattling around in the bed of a pickup, not really secured. Think about what could be happening to those containers if you're barreling down the highway. Couple examples of violations we'd see. The upper picture, got a number of pesticides in a backpack sprayer just sitting out in the open, possibly abandoned. Nobody present or maintaining control over this. In the lower picture, we've got pesticides on a toolbox on the back of a truck, and that's good. They're in a secure spot. They're in an enclosed container. It's not the passenger compartment, but it's just sitting open and unlocked and accessible to anybody who happens by. So this was just a quick run through of some of the really important regulations to know about and things where we see a lot of problem spots. There's a lot more information online from DPR's website. And again, our office is a resource. We're here for you to answer any of your questions on this or any other pesticide use issues. Any questions?
There is one in the Q&A asking if there are templates somewhere for signage.
I believe there are. I don't have a link handy at the moment, but I'm happy to follow up on that.
Any other questions for Julia? Well, if you do think of any, you can email myself or Ag Commissioner's office, and we can get those answered for you. And I think then the next presenter will be Noah.
All right, thanks everybody.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Noah. I, like Julia, work with the Santa Barbara County Ag Commissioner's Office. I'm actually based out of the Buellton office. Let me just share my screen here real quick. Oh, Mel, I think you'll need to let me share my screen.
Okay, you should be good now, Noah.
Thank you.
There we go. We can see it.
Perfect. All right, so today we'll be going over briefly just some methods for vertebrate pest control. There are, obviously a number of different vertebrate pests in California. Today I'll just focus mainly on ground squirrels and gophers, both of which can cause some pretty serious damage, both to traditional, commodity ag land and other land. As Jack noted earlier, any sort of disturbance does create and increase chances for invasives to come in. And there is a lot of disturbance and ground disturbance that can be caused by ground squirrels and gophers. And that can increase the likelihood for the intrusion of weeds into native habitat. So, as you can see here on the right, we've got some gopher mounds on the left, some ground squirrel burrows there. I'll focus mainly on California ground squirrels in this presentation here. Those California ground squirrels are kind of the most common that you'll find. They're throughout California. And those burrows, they look, not too big in the pictures here, but they can be anywhere from, 5 to 25 feet long and up to 6 feet deep. So they can be pretty substantial. One of the things to keep in mind throughout this presentation is that while gophers are pretty active year-round, even in winter, ground squirrels have a pretty specific activity cycle that can kind of impact the efficacy of different control methods. So you can see on the right here, this is a chart provided by UCANR, kind of showing California ground squirrel life cycle. As you can see, they have a pretty long hibernation period through the winter. Obviously, that depends kind of on where you are in the state. If you're somewhere colder, that's going to be longer. If you're in a relatively warm climate, that's going to be colder. But in general, there's not a lot of control that you can do for ground squirrels during the winter months, just because they're not at all active. And then once you hit spring and things heat up, they do start their breeding and gestation cycle. And then through the summer months are relatively active, and then have another short kind of period of summer dormancy that, depending on where you are, again, that can be, a few days to longer if you're somewhere that's much hotter. And then towards the fall months, they're going to start foraging more on seeds and start storing more seeds for the winter. So, we'll get a little bit later on, get into why that's important, but that life cycle can really impact what sort of control methods are going to be effective. So there are a number of control methods that you can use for vertebrate pest control, habitat modification, biological control, trapping, and then the use of pesticides, either through baits or through fumigants. Having a successful pest management program is probably going to rely on using a mix of these methods. You probably won't get away with just using one. It's not going to be quite as effective. There are other control methods that folks use, but they aren't really that effective. There's not really much in the way of like frightening or scare devices that you can use for vertebrate pests the way that you can for birds. Flooding is an option for gophers, but it's not really going to kill them. It often just forces them from their burrows. And, when you're talking about kind of wildland management or range management, you obviously don't have the access to a steady supply of irrigation water like a traditional ag grower would to even make flooding an option. There are other options in terms of like carbon monoxide devices that can be used, but they're pretty expensive and time consuming. So we'll just focus on these 5 today. So in terms of habitat modification, for squirrels, there are a couple things that can be done. One of the main things is regarding reinfestation. They do take over old burrows. So if you are in a place where there are old burrows and you've managed to kind of deal with a squirrel issue, getting rid of those burrows would make a pretty big difference. Usually filling them in isn't just going to do the trick because it's pretty hard to fill them all the way in from outside. So usually kind of deep ripping them is going to be the best practice there. They also don't necessarily like dense vegetation, so mowing or, intense grazing is gonna kind of open up areas that they might be more prone to inhabiting. That said, if you are kind of managing a place that does have a lot of areas, brush or debris piles, things like that, where they do like to hide, getting rid of those also would kind of increase your ability to both see where they are, access their burrows, and kind of, reduce the likelihood that they're going to be hiding in those areas. For gophers, I did just want to mention, exclusion of gophers can be somewhat effective. It's really only going to be effective on a small scale. It's pretty hard to do a good job excluding gophers from, 1,000-acre rangeland that you're managing or something like that. But if there are specific areas that you're having a gopher issue with, exclusion on the smaller scale can be effective. Usually folks do that with some sort of wire mesh, hardware cloth or wire mesh netting that you'll bury a couple feet deep, and then it is helpful to extend that above the ground a little bit if possible, perhaps along a fence line. But that it's not going to keep gophers out 100%, but it can be a good tool for reducing the reinfestation or reintrusion of gophers into an area. That's not really going to be at all possible with squirrels, just because they're very hard to keep out. As far as biological control goes, there are a lot of animals that hunt vertebrate pests, both gophers and squirrels and others. That said, there's just not a lot of evidence that, especially when you're someplace with a serious vertebrate pest problem, that you are going to be able to get enough control through, things like coyotes or raptors. Predators aren't just going to be effective enough to manage large gopher ground squirrel populations that are causing issues. And there's really not that much evidence that, adding nest boxes for owls or, installing raptor perches is going to be enough, is going to kind of attract enough predator pressure to have that much of an impact. There is the option, depending on where you are. Obviously no population of animals is going to increase forever. So one alternative to managing gophers or ground squirrels is to kind of let things run their course. Eventually the population will limit itself. But of course, depending on where you are or what lands you're managing, that level might be high enough that it's causing a substantial amount of damage. So for most folks, that may be an option, but also may not. Trapping is also actually a relatively effective tool. That depends obviously on the geography of the area, the size of the land you're managing, and what the pest pressure is like. But it is effective, and control through trapping can be possible. It's often best used a tool alongside other tools, especially once you've been able to reduce pest pressure a fair amount. Then you can use trapping to just kind of mitigate things and to prevent the population from getting out of hand. For gophers, trapping obviously is always going to be done in their burrows. For squirrels, you can do it either at the burrow entrances or use wire cage traps elsewhere if their burrow entrances aren't necessarily accessible. Again, for squirrels, trapping is really going to have to be done in non-winter months because they're going to be essentially dormant. Whereas for gophers, places I've worked, we've had the best success trapping during the winter because ground cover is usually at a minimum, and it's much easier to tell where active burrows are. It's a waste of time to trap in burrows that aren't active. So you do want to be able to tell where those active gopher burrows are. One thing I want to mention, for gophers, there isn't going to be much in the way of live catch traps, but for squirrels there are. That said, relocation of squirrels isn't going to be allowed in California without a permit. So, you know, essentially you could catch them in live traps and then release them back onto your property, which doesn't necessarily fix your problem. So just keep that in mind when you are choosing what sort of traps to use. This is just kind of getting back to that question of what sort of control methods are going to be useful at what time of the year. You know, here we can see, you know, we've got our biological control and exclusion, which is somewhat not that efficacious, as well as habitat modification. You know, trapping again, and this is going to be for squirrels here, can be relatively effective, but only through those spring through fall months. And then at the middle of the chart here, you'll see fumigation and toxic baits as other management methods. And you'll notice those are kind of split in regards to where they are effective. You got your fumigation effective in the spring months and your toxic baits effective through the summer months into the fall. And we'll, you know, the reason for that, if you'll notice, is that the diet for squirrels is pretty much split throughout the year. You know, when they first come out of hibernation, they're going to be essentially eating mainly green forage. And then as the year goes on, they're going to transition more into seeds and things like that, which resemble more closely baits. And so there's a higher likelihood that, you know, after they're done eating that green forage, they're going to be more attracted to foraging for bait because that's just, you know, their natural activity. You'll see here that it notes on this chart that toxic baits are kind of highly effective all the way through October. Again, that's kind of going to depend on where you are. At a certain point, you know, ground squirrels especially are going to start stashing food away. And so they might end up taking a lot of that bait and then just stashing it away and not necessarily consuming it as they get closer and closer to winter. And when that time period is might shift depending on, you know, how early it starts getting cold where you are. So that said, you know, that kind of leaves us with these last two control methods. You know, I have them as different. Baiting and the use of fumigants is somewhat different, but they are essentially the same. It's the use of pesticides or chemical means to manage those vertebrate populations. So looking at baits first, you know, there's a couple options of baits to use. There's quite a few different pesticide formulations or active ingredients. Probably the most common one that we see used around here, and especially the most common one for ground squirrels, is going to be difascinone, which is just a standard anticoagulant. There's several other anticoagulants, chlorofascinone and others, but difascinone is definitely the most commonly one used in our area. There's a bunch of different companies that produce difascinone and other anticoagulant products, and one thing to really keep in mind that Julia did touch on is that these are all going to have different labels. So difascinone and other anticoagulant baits can be used in bait stations. They can be used for spot treatments, broadcast applications. But the specific label for the product that you're using may not allow for that. So it's just really, really important to pay attention to the label that you're using. And we'll look at some examples of this later. Strychnine is also an option, and it's probably most effective for gophers. It's relatively lethal in a single feeding, whereas the anticoagulants are going to take multiple feedings. You know, there are some difascinone products that are also labeled for gophers, but for the most part, people are going to use strychnine much more often. You know, for baiting, there is, if you are doing underground bait applications and for things like strychnine for gophers, really any bait for gophers, for the most part, those are going to be required by the label to be underground applications to the burrow. There really is there's a skill to it. It is very easy to waste a lot of bait by doing it improperly. And not putting it someplace that's going to be effective. You know, for gophers, that's going to be in their main underground tunnel. You're not really going to want to spread that out in their lateral tunnels. And then you also don't want to treat tunnels that they've plugged up because they're not really going to be active in there. So it is, I've kind of found it is helpful actually to kind of do a little, if you're new to baiting for gophers, and same for trapping for gophers, to do a little exploring, open some of their burrows up, you know, look at what their tunnel systems look like, and you know, over time, you'll get a lot better at identifying what burrows are active and, you know, where that bait placement is going to be most effective. Same for traps as well. So just to look at the differences in some of these labels, there are homeowner formulations, both of strychnine and anticoagulants, which means that, you know, for the most part, anybody can go into a Home Depot or, you know, a farm supply store and buy a strychnine bait or a zinc phosphide bait or a diphacinone bait. That said, that is usually going to be limited to small package sizing, and the labels for these products are going to limit their use to in and around buildings, residences, or structures. So we can see here, this is a Wilco Zinc homeowner bait, 2% zinc phosphide. And if you look at the bottom use restriction box here, it says this product may only be used to control pocket gophers and manual below ground applications in lawns. So this is a very limited label, and that's because zinc phosphide is a relatively hazardous product. And so when you are selling this to homeowners, they're going to be limited in their uses. Now, here we have another zinc phosphide 2% bait, also made by Wilco, and this is their zinc ag bait label. This label is much more open. You can see on the right for pocket gophers, you can essentially use it in rangelands, pastures, you know, all sorts of areas, non-crop areas, grain fields, forage crops, essentially anywhere. It still needs to be put underground, but it can be used across a much larger spectrum of settings. And then this label also allows for use for the control of ground squirrels. At the top, you'll notice, however, that this is now considered a restricted use pesticide. And so that is just one thing to keep in mind, is that that difference between what is, you know, a homeowner product, which is not restricted, and what is an actual restricted use pesticide. So federally restricted use pesticides, the federal government is actually the one that makes these determinations on labels. It's not done at a state level. And when you're using a restricted use pesticide, you need to be a certified applicator. For most folks today, that is going to require getting some sort of either qualified applicator license or a qualified applicator certificate. And that would be done through the state. If you are a commodity ag grower, so if you're managing like rangeland for commodity ag production, then you could get a private applicator certificate through the county. So just something to keep in mind if you are going to use any of those restricted use pesticides. There are also what we call California restricted materials, and these are restricted on the state level. And for these, you'd both need to be a certified applicator or have some sort of certified applicator certificate. And then you would also need a restricted material permit from the county ag commissioner. So these products would be like zinc phosphide, aluminum phosphide, and strychnine are all going to be California restricted materials. For these products also, you need to submit a notice of intent to the county 24 hours prior to applications you make. There's a couple qualifications there regarding zinc phosphide and strychnine, but especially for aluminum phosphide, that notice of intent is going to be required 24 hours ahead of time every time you use it. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about what products you may or may not want to use. The other thing to keep in mind when you're looking at products is just, again, you know, read those labels. If you're working with like a pesticide dealer, you know, they're usually pretty knowledgeable about what labels are going to allow for what type of use. You know, here we've got 3 diphacinone products: PCQ pelleted rodent bait, the ground squirrel bait by Wilco, and then this Ditrac ground squirrel bait. So they're all diphacinone. But they all have some pretty distinct differences on the label. So if we look at the PCQ bait, it's got 0.01% of diphacinone, whereas the other two have 0.005%. And then the PCQ and the ground squirrel bait are both restricted use pesticides, whereas the ditrac is not restricted. But again, you'll notice on the ditrac label, you can only use it within 100 feet of structures for the control of ground squirrels. So, you know, just keep that in mind. If there are different formulations. If you need a stronger formulation, you can, go to something like this PCQ pelleted rodent bait, which has twice as much active ingredient by weight. But then this pelleted rodent bait label is going to be limited in the use. So that pelleted rodent bait, you have to either hand bait or mechanical bait. Essentially, you need to broadcast it. Whereas the Wilco bait, you cannot broadcast it, and you essentially have to use it in bait stations. So depending on what sort of applications you're looking to make, you really do need to focus on what type of product is going to be the best for you. There are, of course, there's different reasons for wanting to broadcast or kind of spot bait versus using bait stations. Bait stations definitely take a little less effort. You can fill them up and kind of walk away and check on them as needed, where broadcasting, especially around active burrows, you're going to need to do every few days and really monitor, whether that bait is being accepted by the ground squirrels. And you're also going to essentially have to do a lot more work ranging throughout wherever your application area is to find those active burrows. So it's a little bit more time intensive, but also potentially more effective in that you're essentially delivering the bait much closer. Ground squirrels don't really range that far from their burrows that often. So when you're using bait stations, it's going to be a little bit harder to get them to find that bait, as it were. Julia did bring up prescribe. I just wanted to point out, so here we have a diphacinone label, and there's just a note on there for the protection of kangaroo rats. You can use a modified type of bait station. If you ever see these on a label, just go ahead and check prescribe and see if you are in an area with kangaroo rats. We'll see this for other animals, for like kit foxes, things of that sort. So just pay attention to those. If you have any questions, we can always help run you through how to use prescribe and check and see if there are any endangered species considerations that you might have to take into account. And that's going to kind of come into play on the bottom left here. You can see that bait station that has the kind of quote unquote elbows on it for the T bait station on the bottom left. That has actually been modified specifically for use in kangaroo rat territory, where ground squirrels can still access that bait station, but kangaroo rats can't get up there high enough to access that bait. So you might, that might be something that you need to implement depending on where you are. The last thing that I'll cover here is the use of fumigants. Baits are very widely used and are very effective. And the nice thing about them is that, especially for things like the anticoagulants, there are antidotes available. And there's a slightly reduced risk for, non-target poisoning of non-target animals, but there is a chance for secondary poisoning. So, anything that does eat squirrels or rodents, once those rodents have consumed an anticoagulant, it's going to stay in their body for quite a while. And any sort of predators that eat those are then at risk for secondary poisoning. Whereas with a fumigant, they're much faster acting, and there's a very low risk of secondary poisoning unless, an animal that's consumed a fumigant is eaten like immediately afterwards. But there's really very low chance of that, although a slightly higher risk of primary poisoning of non-target animals. That said, fumigants like zinc phosphide and aluminum phosphide are also really effective. Zinc phosphide, again, it's California restricted. You need a certified applicator certification of some sort and a restricted materials permit. Zinc phosphide kind of straddles the line between a bait and a fumigant. It is, essentially when animals consume a zinc phosphide bait, it interacts with some kind of stomach acids and then releases phosphine gas, which is also an aluminum phosphide, but it is formulated as a bait. So it is something that you would put out, broadcast or put into burrows. Zinc phosphide can't be used for bait stations, however. And whereas aluminum phosphide, again, you need that restricted materials permit and some sort of applicator certification, but this is going to be deposited directly into burrows. And then the interaction between, the tablet or the pellet of aluminum phosphide and moisture in the ground is going to start that reaction and release phosphine gas. So this method is obviously only going to work where there is moisture in the ground. Around here, that's can be a pretty limited time of the year. It's really going to only be effective in the spring. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes it's going to be more effective to have a management program where you're using some sort of fumigant in the spring and maybe a bait later in the year, and then conducting your trapping kind of on either end of the fall or winter. Again, with the aluminum phosphide, something like this, it's a pretty hazardous product. And so if you do use that out of season, you start using that in the middle of summer, essentially what you'd be doing is just depositing aluminum phosphide tablets in the ground that are still active. And then when it does rain or when you get that moisture, they can actually start to release that phosphine gas, which may not be ideal if there's animals around that you didn't anticipate earlier on. So there are again, much more increased requirements for the use of aluminum phosphide. We'll likely have to post the application site, come up with a fumigation management plan, send in a notice of intent before every application and get a permit, but it can be a pretty effective use method. So at the end of the day, using a bunch of these methods in concert with each other is going to be the most effective, and being proactive is going to be really helpful. Like some of the other speakers have noted, once you let things get out of control, it's really hard to gain control. And so just, if you are having a management issue with any sort of vertebrate pests, or if they are causing, ground disturbance in a way that is increasing the likelihood of weed intrusion, staying on top of that as much as possible is going to be your best bet. And if you may have to resort to some sort of pesticide or chemical use to help reduce that pest pressure. And then once you get it down, below to a reasonable threshold, then you can just kind of be proactive with that, habitat modification and trapping, and use that to keep it at a reasonable level. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions?
There is a question in the Q&A. Are there concerns with using toxic baits or fumigants on ground squirrels on farms where dogs, cats, and other livestock are present?
Yes, that is a good question, and there definitely are. That's where it's really going to be important to kind of look at what those hazards are going to be. Look at what the presence of, is it children who are present? Is it going to be pets who are present? Is it livestock? And if so, you can kind of tailor your bait or fumigant use to that situation. If you have pets and livestock present, maybe you don't want to use a bait that you're going to be broadcasting all over the ground. Maybe you want to use something that's only going to be put straight and directly into a burrow, or maybe you're going to use a bait station that is situated in such a way that pets and livestock can't access it, but ground squirrels could, for example. So you definitely want to take that into account, when choosing which type of product you're going to use.
Any other questions for Noah? Or any other questions for Julia and Noah?
Hey, Julia here. I wanted to circle back to the question from Andrea about application rates. So what I'm trying to get at with what I said is you can't ever use higher than the label rate. That's never going to be legal. In most circumstances, it's legal to use less, not necessarily recommended. So that's the distinction. Obviously, with issues of resistance, that's not something we want to see. But in most situations, less is legal.
Thank you for clarifying that. Any other questions
Yeah, Anna,
from the participants?
if we
Yeah,
don't have.
Yeah, I'm just going to do my wrap up because I have to jump off because I'm late for another meeting.
No problem, go for it.
So I just want to do a quick wrap up and then you can do the continuing education if that's okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to say thanks for everyone for joining us today. Like I said at the beginning, we do have a WMA meeting tomorrow morning as well as a site visit. And so I'm just putting another plug in here at the end for you all to email me if you're interested in attending. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat. And so if you also have any other questions after the fact, please feel free to email myself or Mel or Stephanie, and we can hopefully get those questions answered for you, as well as we are hoping to have the recording and slide presentations available after the presentation as well. So we'll send out information afterwards to help provide those links for you all. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to you, Mel, and you can go over all of the quiz questions and all of that. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Again, this is Mel, and if you need continuing education for your DPR licenses, again, just a reminder, this is how you get it. So now that the course is complete, I'm going to go ahead and put a link to the exam and leave that in the chat for just a few minutes. I'm also going to be emailing that link to everyone. You're going to fill out a quick registration portion for the exam, take the exam. You can retake it as many times as you need to pass it with 70%. And then you're going to receive a certificate of completion. So this is kind of what the page will look like. And then your certificate. So the certificate you download and you keep that for your own records. So I'm going to go ahead and leave up our presenters' emails in case you wanted to grab a screenshot of that. And then our other folks. So this is all of our county people. And then Anna is also on here as far as the WMA. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put that link into the chat and leave that up for just a few minutes. Okay, so now you can click on the link in the chat. You can take that to the quiz. I'll leave that up for just a few minutes and then I'll send an email out to everybody with a reminder of the site visit tomorrow and also the link to the test. Thank you guys all for attending. If you have any questions about continuing education for this course, please go ahead and call our office and they'll connect you to me and I can help you out with that.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, presenters.
Thank you,
Wonderful
everyone.
getting everybody to contribute, and we appreciate all the discussion we had today, and have a good rest of your week. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.